don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I talked with Karen Vaites, who describes herself as a literacy advocate, curriculum maven, children's advocate, and mom. She is the founder of the Curriculum Insight Project, and you can find that work on Substack. We'll put a link to that and other places she inhabits online in the show notes. I've been aware of Karen for quite some time, as she's quite active on social media, but her name was offered as someone who might be an interesting counterbalance to the conversation I had a few episodes ago with Rachel Jefferson. If you'll recall, that episode centered on an online piece where Rachel made the claim that the science of learning movement was, quote-unquote, soul-destroying. So our conversation started there and then moved on to some other related topics like my concerns about the rigidity of the science of learning. Karen is an advocate in the area of reading instruction, so we also talked about the current lack of emphasis on books and kids reading longer form content in ELA. And as my conversations often do, we wandered back into the explicit instruction versus inquiry-based learning debate, and that included addressing tribalism and nuance in education, her suggestion to move beyond debates to practical curriculum discussions, knowledge-rich schooling and curriculum design, the role of critical thinking and domain specificity, addressing declining NAEP scores, and the importance of coherent curriculum and collaboration. As always, before we get to our conversation, I urge you to check out our website, wegrowteachers.com, if you are interested in our professional development services. We have some exciting new things like a differentiated instruction online course and an AI co-pilot that will be a really great thought partner and tool in our PBL work. But we also do work in other areas, and you can see all of that, again, at wegrowteachers.com. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, you are more than welcome to reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now, here's my conversation with Karen. I am with Karen Vaites, and we're going to talk about soul-destroying science of learning and probably lots about science of reading and who knows what else, but as I usually like to do, and I'll welcome you to the podcast and give you an opportunity to say hello and introduce yourself and give the folks a little bit of background on who they're listening to on the other end of this connection.
Hi, Drew, and thanks for having me. I'm Karen Vaites, and I am a sort of literacy advocate and children's advocate based in New York. I come to this work after doing lots of years being close to the curriculum space and the shifts in the curriculum space. For a while, about 8 years ago to 10 years ago, I spent 2 years at Open Up Resources, the nonprofit curriculum provider that brought bookworms to the world for the first time and helped to advance EL education in the world and illustrative math. So after doing my time in the curriculum space and also getting a sense of that landscape, I came away with some pretty passionate ideas about the value of really good curriculum and also the challenges for teachers when they aren't given good curriculum, whether that's given no curriculum or given crummy curriculum. And then, of course, I have watched the science of reading movement really closely. So I have tried to be the lead learner there. I'm continuing to build on my own understanding of how kids best learn to read, but I'm endlessly interested in additional info about how we produce more successful readers and mathematicians here in this country.
Okay, well, that's probably at least a good foundational start. When we get into science of reading stuff, I'm sure we'll unpack more about that. But what was your, your K-12 and to the extent you want to talk about any higher education experience, what was that like for you? How would you describe the teaching and the education that you got? Because sometimes I think that can be really interesting and helpful to provide some context for the way that people think.
Yeah, I grew up in Pennsylvania and I went to the local public school district. I think that I got a good really solid education from that district. It was, and would continue to be described, I've still got family members there, as a solid school district, not necessarily, one of the big brand name top performer in the state kind of districts. But I came away with, to my mind, when I got to college and I attended a liberal arts college, I felt prepared to be successful in college, and I had good academic experiences while I was there. So I would say I had a really good public school experience. The more I've grown up and the more I've had a chance to talk with other friends about their academic experiences, I do have a little bit of envy of some friends here and there who had more rigorous high school experiences than I necessarily did. I think I probably went to a school that had moderate rigor, but not necessarily the highest rigor. But I still would, I would send my kids to that district today if I lived in the area. So.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I guess as a follow-up question, because you talked about rigor, and I think it will be important as we get into at least the first part of the conversation of thinking about science of learning, which is, I think, pretty focused, I would say, on the idea of rigor. Would you describe the sort of teaching approaches that you experienced? I think about it as a sort of spectrum, something more traditional on one end and direct or explicit instruction, that side of the spectrum being more science of learning kind of oriented, and then on the other, more constructivist and inquiry and progressive is a label there, and certainly lots of room and I would say sort of overlap, but maybe not everybody thinks that way. And so I'm curious, like, how would you characterize your K-12 experience as a student on either ends of those spectrums, or would it be a mix, or how would you describe it?
I think I would characterize it as pretty down the middle. Certainly I remember doing project-based work growing up, but I also very much, enough of the work that we did, I honestly, it looked a lot like the way we think of public school, or think of schools and imagine it in our conception. We did a lot of novel study in the years that you remember the most are the middle and upper grades, right? I remember a lot of novel grounded study and a lot of, traditional essay-like approaches to writing. I went through the standard math progression as these things go, and algebra in 8th grade onward. So, and I do know from an elementary perspective more from my mom, because my mom is an educator, and was a career educator, now retired, that when I went to elementary school, it was an era when there was more focus on traditional approaches to phonics and foundational skills. But I'm not going to tell you that I have an intimate memory of what it was like to be a first grader doing those progressions.
Right. Okay, well, one of the reasons we initially planned to talk on the podcast was your name was one of the names that surfaced in, I don't know, maybe a kerfuffle is a way to describe Rachel Jefferson, who was a guest on the podcast, I don't know, a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago. And she had a piece that was published, I think, based on an interview with her in, I think it's TES is the publication. And in that article, she referred to the science of learning as something like soul destroying, and certainly had lots of criticism, which of course on social media, of which you're quite active, Twitter, X, and I think some other places as well, but probably mostly on Twitter. And that certainly got the social media world, at least in the education space, really activated. And of course, one of the things I like to do is have conversations with different people. And so Carl Hendrick, I think, maybe recommended your name. And so we've been playing tag a little bit, and finally to have you on here. So I guess I think you said you listened to at least most of the conversation with Rachel, and I think you probably have read her piece. What are your impressions on that, I guess, tension and that conflict, and anything you want to say about, the work that she's sort of advocating for?
So it was really interesting to see this bubble up. She is Australian and she made a lot of references to the British context, but we've seen many of these talking points before from academics in the States. Ironically, there's a professor here in the States who's also named Rachel, who has been overheard in the last handful of years saying many of the same things about curriculum specifically. So if I understand correctly, her most pointed comments about what is soul destroying is the use of scripted curriculum. Mm-hmm. And her real beef isn't necessarily with any approach to teaching. She claims to want a broad church and teachers should leverage every option on the continuum from a pedagogical perspective, but scripted curriculum, that's the real evil. And her rationale is that scripted curriculum is effectively deprofessionalizing for teachers. What's interesting about that narrative, because we have heard this in the States before, is it consistently comes out of academics who are, you almost never hear a sitting teacher saying, this is deprofessionalizing me as a teacher. When this argument is made, it's basically always made by an academic who's coming from a political framing of the world. And it's almost like a labor-based set of argumentation that if the argument in education goes, if I give teachers these scripts, you'll hear people say, it's trying to introduce a standardized factory model of education. And if people could see me, they could see me doing air quotes around this, right? This term that Rachel actually used in your podcast, this factory model of education and standardizing the education is deprofessionalizing of teachers because, and these weren't words she used, but the theory seems to go, because it robs teachers of all of this freedom and it makes teachers more interchangeable. And when you do hear people make the labor-based argument around this, you could take less skilled people if teachers are just cogs in a wheel who can just deliver a curriculum, well then it's that much easier for, we can value teachers that much less as a society. So the argument virtually never goes to the level of saying, here's the actual curriculum, here's the actual book that educators are being given. Let's look at the quote unquote script and say whether that particular thing is good, bad, or indifferent. It's not actually about the materials themselves. It's about a preconceived set of ideas about what it means to be a professional. Now, this set of arguments is so easy to counter. And in my mind, we value teachers the most as professionals when we give them the best tools. When we invest in the highest quality resources to give to teachers. And we respect teachers the most as professionals when we give them excellent materials that don't require them to do extra labor that isn't actually in the 8:30 to 3 p.m. or whatever your school hours are job description, which is developing materials for your teachers. In teacher preparation, we don't train teachers on curriculum development. So to show up on a job and to be asked to do something that is outside of what many teachers even want to be doing for themselves, and they have to be doing nights and weekends. You can't do curriculum development. You aren't given as a teacher enough PD to be developing your own curriculum. So to push curriculum development to teachers, which is pushing night and weekend work to people that they are not, one would argue, paid adequately for, I think that's deprofessionalizing to teachers. And in fact, giving teachers good materials and only good materials is the sort of highest signal of respect. Now, I've already joked with you when we were, meeting each other, you'll find me as a curriculum advocate to be the most ardent supporter of really quality curriculum that's worthy of teachers. And you'll also find me to be the biggest fire-breathing dragon in naming the issues with weak curricula. I think it's criminal when we give teachers really crummy curriculum and then expect them to teach with fidelity to something that is gross and uninspiring and not pedagogically strong. I certainly think it's criminal when we give teachers materials that don't align to what we know about learning sciences. So I talk out of both sides of my mouth on this, and you will hear me in social media this week. You alluded to spending time on X. What I spent time on this morning and yesterday and the last handful of days has been talking about curricula in America that have really high market share, but actually no books for kids. Like, that's horrifying. That is horrifying for the kids in those classes. That is horrifying for the teachers in those classes. It's horrifying about the fact that those teachers are expected to do the things in those curriculum, but also teachers consistently want excellent books in their classes. So then they're having to supplement curricula. Why are districts spending tens of thousands of millions of dollars to then have teachers having to go do all of the supplementation work? It's just lunacy. So I am both an anti-curriculum person and an ardent curriculum person in equal measure, depending on which curriculum we're talking about. But that's what the conversation needs to be. We need to be saying what curriculum is worthy of teachers, what resources are good enough to really enable excellent teaching of teachers and by teachers. And yes, in all of this, we need to be honoring that teachers should not be expected to just teach from a script, and there should fully be the expectation that the teacher makes the curriculum come alive with his or her students, but also is going to see those times that students need different skill developments, or they identify a skill gap that some prior skills that they've got to take a moment and press time out on the curriculum and address and support students differently. And teachers are going to be supplementing and tweaking and making changes year to year because the students in front of them are not the same this year as last year. All those things are true. And this idea of teach from a script and teach to strict fidelity is not where any reasonable person is in this space. But at the same time, curriculum and its existence is soul destroying. Well, I can't support anyone that won't actually go to the tapes and talk about what's in the materials and what are we putting in front of kids and in front of teachers, and makes it about, pedagogical philosophy that is really, when they get into it, more about their politics than anything.
Well, a lot to unpack there, and I'm trying to remember, not doubting the veracity of what you said, of what she's referring to, but it's been a while since I talked with her, and I didn't go back and re-listen. I'm not saying what you are referring to and associating with her claims or whatever isn't true. I guess when I'm thinking about and wondering about, when I'm listening to you talk about the sort of tension there, I was making some notes. I was thinking about sort of the joy and the art of teaching, and then what I sometimes perceive as, with the science of learning, kind of movement, right? And that's a gross generalization because there are people who are very nuanced in their work there. And in some ways, I consider myself an advocate of science of learning, but probably, like, I think about the research ed kind of scene and sort of giggle at the idea of my presence there, because I think some folks might wonder why I was there, or I've had some sort of conflicts and some tension with some folks that run in that crowd. And I guess one of the things that I think about or wonder or have concerns about with science of learning, and maybe this is what Rachel's sort of referring to, and if not, then fine, I'm referring to it, is the sort of narrowness and rigidity that of which they sort of approach. They tend to approach, the idea of teaching and learning, and that there is evidence that shows this is the most effective and efficient way to teach. And I often think, effective at what, right? So what are the desirable academic outcomes that we're after? And what seems to me to be true, curious how you think about this, is that there's that sort of implies a very narrow set of academic outcomes of, change in long-term memory, so knowledge, and that may be long-term, but it's sometimes I wonder about that. Is it actually long-term, or is it long enough to be tested and we see some results, that kind of thing? But if we think about like surface deep and transfer learning, the framework that Hattie uses, are we getting into deep learning? My assumption is that they do, but they just don't talk about it very often, for a variety of reasons, and we can get into that. But that's the thing that I wonder about, because it just feels like there's such a rigidity there. And as a teacher who wants to sort of engage in that art of teaching, not just the science of teaching, but that art of teaching, which is really joyful when you experience it, it feels like the sort of science of learning movement often, or too often, sort of preaches a messaging that is, I guess, sort of inhibits that kind of thing. So I'm curious what you think about that.
I love this question about rigidity because like you, I get disappointed when the world gets a little too tribal and people start talking past each other because of their camps.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not speaking about anyone specifically here in any of this, and I came with no beef, other than some beef with Rachel's philosophy about all of this. But I'm going to take that on in a second, because where you started there, this question of, I do have the benefit of recency. I just listened to your
Right.
today.
Yeah, tell me what I said.
So having just heard it today, and I've got a few handy notes in front of me, so I'm fresh of memory. And what's striking about the conversation is that I couldn't take on the question that you just asked me and represent what Rachel's perspective was in any real direction, because the conversation wasn't about what should be happening in classrooms. The conversation never really got to pedagogy in any way. So I don't even know what type of learning Rachel would be espousing or standing against. She claims to be in favor of all things, but the rubber didn't really meet the road in the conversation. Instead, Rachel was saying these, the most wild line that came out of that conversation, unprompted, multiple times she was talking about how the science of learning movement is consistent with a neoliberal framing of the world.
Mm-hmm.
What? It's really someone that's, in my mind, looking to take a political framing or to turn political framing into a way to dismiss what's a conversation about how kids best learned and what research tells us, and which research are we listening to, right? Like there's this whole, anybody having these substantive conversations is really sitting there trading in the research about like, how does learning happen, and how do we best produce skilled writers, and what's the right volume of this type of work versus that type of work to produce a learning outcome. And we can, those conversations, we could go on all day. Y'all didn't get there, but she definitely wanted to talk about the neoliberal ultimate meta framing of the science of learning conversation. She took this one line, unprompted. She volunteered that she had this Foucauldian critique of government, where she believes that the science of learning is really a government smokescreen to avoid addressing children's poverty. Like, what? I mean, the idea that a bunch of educators get together on our nights and weekends, and education affiliated people like myself get together nights and weekends to gobble up articles about learning and then discuss practice that happens in classrooms, and that there's anything there that is really just doing that as avoidance of our preference that governments do things to address childhood poverty. It's just ludicrous on its face. So again, there was a lot of political framing and reframing, and I'm not encouraging people to necessarily go listen to the conversation, because I don't think they'll take all that much away from it in the way of, is the science of learning, good, bad, or indifferent, or how can we better refine the conversations we have in the science of learning arena. But I do think that anybody that's in this arena should be aware that there are some parties, often academics, pretty much consistently academics, who take these political frames that almost come out of a labor theory class and try to apply them to, so we're kind of talking about apples and watermelons. Let me shift gears though, and actually answer the question that you were getting to in the latter part there, which is, what do I think about the science of learning, conversations? And, to be honest with you, I hear what you're saying about people in their camps. This isn't, I think, where you were going exactly, but I'll talk for a second about how I think some of these conversations in literacy have come full circle. Right now, we are in this place where there aren't that many parties who are elevating the importance of books and kids reading longer form content, reading whole books as part of ELA, in order to build their reading stamina. And I found myself in a little bit of shock when I started doing some advocacy this week, where I wrote a piece published over the weekend that talked about the specific curricula that are very book starved. In the case of Wonders, there are no books, no chapter books in grade 3, no books of, I would define, once you get past grade 3, if you're reading a children's book, that's like a short story, right? So if it's a picture book in 4th grade, I'm not going to call that a book. I want to see chapter books or whole plays. I want to see substantive content before I'm going to call something a book. And there are no books in Wonders, grades 4 to 6. So we've got 6th graders who are reading. The average text length in Wonders in the basal is 7.3 pages. The longest text in Wonders in grade 6 is 18 pages, and that's 18 illustrated pages. So if I go subtract the pages that are full page illustrations, it's consistently texts that are less than 15 pages. So you're not going to get 6th graders building reading stamina if the max text length is 15 pages. That's just pathetic. So I spoke out about that, and I was talking about that problem, and that it's not just about Wonders. In the basal category, we have these text light programs that are very prevalent in classrooms. Wonders has almost 20% market share in US elementary schools. Into Reading is another program with similar DNA that is equally popular, if not more so, and it's in most New York City elementary schools. So I think that's a problem. And most educators I talk with say, yeah, English language arts, of course we should have novels and whole-length books. But there started to be people in science of reading groups saying, well, wait, but what's the evidence base for that? Where's the research that shows that whole books are necessary? And I got to tell you, I was almost falling off my chair. We absolutely have evidence, a strong evidence base for volume of reading that flies in the face of what we're seeing qualitatively in these programs, quantitatively in these programs. The sheer reading volume done in these programs doesn't come close to the reading volume in better programs. But a lot of that research was, most advocated for and advanced by people who were of the whole language camp. So Dick Allington is one of the bigger promoters of the research around volume of reading. Dick Allington was right about that. Now, along the way, Dick Allington got canceled in part because he said some sort of dyslexia denialist things and was really sharp-elbowed in the way that he did so. So lots of folks in the science of reading camp think less of him. And in general, if we look at the way that the science of reading conversation has evolved, there has been, focus upon focus on the nuances of how phonemic awareness should be developed and speech to print or print to speech. Like, people are parsing over studies and philosophies and approaches around how foundational skills are taught. And the conversation hasn't really centered hey, what's the evidence base for high volume of reading? It's not that it never comes up, but it comes up pretty rarely. But that's a good example of, the science of reading still includes all that research on volume of reading. And we shouldn't be throwing out babies with bathwater in terms of embracing uh, embracing books in our classrooms at the heart of instruction. I could go on about lots of other research elements that tie to the value of working with rigorous whole class texts. But fundamentally, we're in this moment where even within the science of reading community, you start to have camps of people who are trying to advance different elements of the research base and different pedagogical approaches that are most aligned with how they think instructional time should be spent. And so people are tribal in nature, and I suppose I've come to accept that. But to kind of take that program back to some of these other discussions we're having, I would say the trope that we're starting to see around the science of learning movement of, either you are for direct instruction or you are for inquiry, when in fact any reasonable person will say, if you look at good lessons over the course of a year, you're going to find elements of both. There's no like teacher, the straw men that we put out there for what both of those types of instruction look like really exist in painfully few classrooms around the country. The rubber meets the road in discussing two things: percentage of time that goes to different types of instruction. But here's my favorite new paradigm. I think we need to talk more about the novice to expert learner paradigm, because it's the novice learners that we need to do the most explicit work with to be giving kids foundational skills in reading and in math. And then once you have your foundations, your foundational skills and your foundational knowledge, you are equipped to actually go forth and do more project-based or inquiry-oriented work, because you've got the knowledge to even think critically with, to take, one commonly used buzz phrase in all of this. So I really think that we need to be introducing new paradigms to this discussion that get us away from, are you in this camp or are you in that camp, to what's the progression look like? What's the K5 progression on the skill development of these skills? And not, do we want kids doing critical thinking, but what is the right raw material for critical thinking, and what does critical thinking look like for a novice learner versus an expert learner?
Yeah, so the tribalism, I mean, I guess I'm not willing to accept that that we're stuck in tribalism, even though I probably should. It seems like we are, but I'm fighting the good fight and trying to break that. Matter of fact, trying to have conversations with different kinds of people is one of the things that I do, right? Got a piece that Cindy Niebel and I are collaborating on to try to move the conversation, to help move the conversation past that sort of us versus them, and yes and, as opposed to either or kind of thing. But it just seems so incredibly difficult, because there, again, that tribalism creates a sort of rigidity, and I think we've got to be understanding of all of the sort of spectrum, and understanding that some schools in some places might have a different set of outcomes and things that they're after than others. And I saw, to your point, I saw somebody on social media recently, you probably saw it too, somebody saying Natalie Wexler is essentially poo-pooing the idea of phonics or something like that, which I don't think is true, but that was the claim, and that it needs to stop or something like that. And I was like, good Lord, what are we doing here? Natalie and Emily Hanford were on a podcast that I did years ago. And, they've had some tension, that kind of thing, but they both recognize, I think they're both coming at the angle in good faith, and a little bit different angle, and understanding each other. But that doesn't seem to happen nearly enough. And, like when I think about a lot of the sort of science of learning kinds of folks, and even getting at that novice to expert learner, the expertise reversal, that dynamic, in general, I agree with you. Like, if somebody is novice and they don't understand, certain sets of knowledge, or concepts, something like that, then explicit instruction is really important. And then as you move into more understanding, the inquiry pieces can deepen that. I would argue that there is some value in sort of framing concepts and work or things with inquiry. I think there's some research that shows that. But what's really interesting is that people who are really sort of rigid and tribal, they find, it's like they find, I don't even know how to characterize it. Maybe you can do this, describe it better with language than I can, because I haven't been able to do it. But it's like they find something like project follow through, and that is absolute evidence that this is what should be done in every classroom all the time, and that inquiry is bad. And they just won't even consider that, well, project follow through is interesting and useful, but there are some critiques to be made of it, just like there are critiques to be made of all kinds of things. And it's just like they find one quote or one research study or something like that, and that's what they run with. And I mean, you've probably seen scripts like this. It's almost like AI responses to things that I put on social media. It's like, yeah, but have you heard about project follow through, or versions of that? And I'm like, yes, I've heard of project follow through. I'm aware. Yes, I'm aware of the expertise reversal. Like, I'm aware of these things, but it's like the dynamic of a college freshman hearing about something for the first time and thinking, well, this is world changing and nobody must know about this. So I'm going to go forth and sort of proselytize and not really have that sort of nuance and complexity, of which I've been called a menace for trying to introduce, and blocked by lots of folks, well, lots of folks, but several folks, on that sort of science of learning spectrum. So I don't know. Is there a better way to describe what I'm trying to describe? Is there more to say about it that is more interesting than the way I've described it?
And this is a little bit meandering, but this is where my head's been lately. I mean, I think we as a society are having to grapple with the ways that social media has coarsened our discourse. Now, to be fair, there are these things called the reading wars and the math wars that raged a long time before we had cell phones and Twitters and all these things. So it's not like there's some halcyon day of people getting together to really discuss the nuances with the highest degree of respect. People have been tribal about these things for a long time. However, I think we all need to be conscious of the fact that social media, kind of to your point, social media puts pressure on us to simplify our points because it's not a conversation. To connect a point, you have to, like the old Mark Twainism, if I could write it, if I had more time, I would have written it shorter kind of thing. You get a lot of the oversimplifying, here's the 85th tweet I've seen about the baseball study or about project follow through, and let's be fair, lots of the world will not have heard of these things. And so there's value in continually going back to the well of some of these baseline pieces of, or foundational studies, foundational pieces of information. But the idea that sometimes that gets translated into, I think that the baseball study is really valuable and therefore, and it's a valuable study. I believe in that and all of the other research that confirms the importance of background knowledge. So all I must want to do is stuff kids with facts, and I don't even care if they are reading books, right? I've been accused of that for advancing the cause of knowledge building, for example. You do see people try to pigeonhole us into, you believe in this or you believe in that. This is why I firmly believe that actually going to the tapes and saying, let's sit down and talk about the actual curriculum. Let's sit down and talk about what should happen in an instructional year for second graders. Let's sit down and talk about the really tangible elements of what instruction should look like. Let's talk about, if you have a 100-minute literacy block, what should be in it and where the time should go. Like, that is how I think we actually best get past this. So let's take an easy example. In the reading wars, theoretically, you had the people that didn't believe in phonics, and or, if we were being nuanced about it, believed that phonics could be taught more implicitly, versus the people who just wanted to drill phonics and wanted to push books out of the classroom, et cetera, et cetera. I've always thought that the easiest antidote to that was to look at any of the curricula that are advocated as high quality curricula in this day and age. And this wasn't true 30 years ago, but in this day and age, all of the curricula incorporate daily systematic phonics and also incorporate work with whole novels and incorporate knowledge building as a part of that whole text work. Like, they all do all the things. Now, they do it differently. They do it variably. Some of the curricula that are described as one notoriously is analytic phonics instead of synthetic phonics, and that really puts some people off. Some of these curricula have more books than others, and the book light ones put some people off. We can have our reasonable disagreements about which of those is strongest and who achieves the best blend. But the idea that today's reading wars are between people who want phonics and people that don't is just lunacy. My other favorite data point, if you want to go argue with anybody about how silly this whole debate is, the current darling of the science of reading community is a woman named Holly Lane, who created a curriculum called UFly. UFly phonics are capped at 30 minutes. It's a 30-minute lesson, period, end of story, and she doesn't want you to spend more time. Now, there is some differentiation time that you can spend with students that are struggling, but like, phonics lesson itself isn't going over 30 minutes. That all by itself, if that has become the runaway success of the science of reading movement, and the average ELA block is 90 minutes, all by itself, we know that we're not talking about like phonics-centric people that want to hoover up the whole ELA block with phonics. The proof is in the pudding right there. But we can never seem to get past the, you talk too much about this and not enough about that, and therefore I'm going to typecast you as thing A or B. We seem, way too inclined to keep the conversations at these reframed reading war kind of levels instead of going to the tapes and going into enough details and nuances that we find those areas where we can have more substantive disagreement even. Like, you might think that there are teachers out there, I'm sure, that think that actually 30 minutes isn't quite enough and there should be more happening than is in UFly. And like, we can have that conversation. What is that thing? But let's talk about whether, like, what's in UFly and what's missing from UFly. Let's have the conversation at that level, not at some 30,000 foot, are you this kind of villain or that kind of villain?
Yeah, lots of villains in these stories, and interestingly, so as you're talking, one of the things that it reminded me of, and especially I usually think about this in terms of maybe a fair way to put it is critique of the sort of science of learning advocates, or sometimes I say evangelists, because I think some of them fit that bill. I mean, it just feels that way. And to be fair, I think there are some folks on the more constructivist inquiry side that I would characterize as evangelists, and I have my critiques of them as well. But the thing that I find, there's sort of an irony that I find in a lot of my conversations with folks who are those sort of evangelist mindset, is that they tend to be sort of math science people. And I taught social studies and psychology, and those are conceptually quite different, right? They're not algorithmic. They're not necessarily foundational, linear in the ways that math or something like that might be. So I think that's part of why we talk past each other a little bit. But I also find it sort of interesting that it feels like a lot of those folks are lacking. The ones that are most critical of inquiry as a sort of teaching approach tend to, in my estimation, what it seems like at least is that they tend to, like, they could really benefit from learning about inquiry because they can't really engage in conversation, or they're not interested in conversation, coming at it from an inquiry mindset of curiosity, of saying, what makes you say that, right? 30 minutes, is that enough? Is that too much? Like, asking those kinds of questions. Instead, it's sort of really sort of concrete, sequential. It's, this is what works best, and we've seen this in evidence, and thus this is what it must be, right? On the other side, and as you were talking, I started thinking about this. So somebody like Rachel, who, I don't think she's all wrong. I certainly, as I told her, I said I wouldn't approach it the way that she would. And the sort of neoliberal Foucaultian stuff is, as I think I said, is like, that's not for me. And that would be another podcast to debate and talk about that. But those folks tend to not be as interested in getting into the sort of nuts and bolts of the granular pieces of instruction, the way that the sort of science of learning evangelists do. So the two are, there's no overlap, because the one needs more inquiry, in my estimation, in how they sort of think about and approach these conversations, and the other needs, maybe, I don't know if I'd say less inquiry, but something more explicit or something like that. And that's why I think it's so important to have that yes and really think again about, what are we trying to accomplish here? What do we want the students to have when they get out of our classroom, our school, or whatever that might be? And those things might be different, right? So I see the step lab videos and the choral response, and I think to myself, as a student, I would probably, at a certain age at least, would opt out from that. I would not want to do that, because that feels very controlling to me. That feels very, I don't like when people tell me what I have to say or what I have to think. But that doesn't mean that it's bad. It means that if parents and students want to do that, then so be it, right? And the same thing, on the other end of a school, it's, like, there's a school of intellectual virtue that I would imagine, and I had one of the administrators and leaders on the podcast, and they do certainly some explicit instruction, but they do a lot of inquiry. And so people on the science of learning side say, oh, that's terrible, right? Or Catherine Burbelsing, who's a friend of mine at Michaela. I don't know if you're familiar with Catherine and Michaela. And we've had multiple conversations in person, on the podcast, through messaging and texts. And, she thinks the inquiry examples that I show are just horrible teaching, which sort of make me chuckle. And I think what she does at Michaela is great. I wouldn't want to teach there. I probably wouldn't be a great setting for my kids, but that doesn't mean it's bad, right? So recognizing the complexity of the ways in which we would teach, and the different students that we're serving, I think it's like that's totally missing from the conversation. There's this sort of imagined generic student that this approach should work for all. With the qualifier, I will say that, when it comes to like something like reading instruction, don't use inquiry, and I tell that explicitly to the teachers that I work with. I've got a daughter who's just now starting her elementary education certification, and I will be very explicit with her, as like, make sure you're embedding phonics and really thinking about those kinds of things. So that and math instruction in a large part too. Like, those are different sort of beasts, but like through the K-12 experience, there's a whole lot more than just learning how to read and learning how to do your times tables.
Well, I think what's particularly interesting here, if we have two sides of a continuum, I mean, I'm unaware of any elementary schools where they're introducing psychology, right? To take one of the topics that you talk about teaching. And Michaela is, I think it's K-8, is it not? if it's
Mm,
if they
I
go
want to.
beyond eighth.
I think they're up to what we would call 12th grade.
Okay.
That's a good question.
If I definitely have high regard for what I know of Michaela, but everything that I have seen focuses on what we would think of in the American context as American or middle school. So um, that's just the purview that I have based on the lenses on Michaela that I have. I've not had the fortune of visiting. Um, so this the sort of paradigm that I'd love to see us discussing these things on, this idea that what is needed for novice learners versus what is needed for what is possible for more expert learners who already have a grounding in a topic. And I mean, it's just different. And so we're effectively sitting here agreeing that there's, explicit instruction for learning how to read it's just plain essential. Like it just is. And I am going to be sitting there based on what I've been exposed to, feeling that way about explicit instruction in all of those, foundational areas, right? I used to be a swim coach. I gave some pretty explicit how to do how to do all things that relate to swimming, right down to how to float lessons. I gave really explicit instruction. I was hands-on holding kids up in the water, right? Doesn't get more explicit than that. But as kids, as you move down that continuum to the kid who's studying psychology and already has some baseline understanding of psychology, well then the learning can be looking different than the type of learning that I'm advocating for those elementary schoolers. So I think that's actually, we could really take a lot of noise out of things if we just applied those constructs more consistently. Doesn't mean we would agree on everything, but it certainly means we could at least take a lot of the disagreement off the table and get down to the essence of where people would apply their philosophies differently.
So what do you think about this? This is one of the things that I sort of hypothesize about, and it's difficult because it's very difficult to quantify and find evidence for, because the results wouldn't show up very quickly, and the evidence might be more qualitative than quantitative. But one of the things that I think is a really important reason to do something like project-based learning inquiry is to develop the inquiry skills and to be able to identify what one might need to know in order to solve a problem. So, for example, talk about math, doing a project-based learning experience where students are creating a tipping guide for a restaurant, and so we're going to do this for the local restaurant. What generating a list of things we need to know. Of course, one of those things you would need to know are something like multiplying multi-number decimals, which of course then you would teach explicitly. So to me, there's a framing process there, but also really sort of modeling the sort of identification of what we need to know in order to do something and do it well. That I think as adults, when we get into the adult world, is a really important skill, and I think something that's really missing. I think we have lots of adults who don't have that skill. I often talk about the sort of 2008 housing crisis, right? People didn't ask the questions of like, what do I need to know when I'm going to buy this house? Because they were told, if I can sort of make the analogy here, they were given the knowledge, right? How much money do you make? Well, you can put $100 down and buy this $10 million house and you'll be fine, right? There's sort of people that preyed on folks who didn't then ask, what happens if I can't make the payment, or what happens if the market goes down, or all of the things that could and in many cases did go wrong. And so when I think about the importance of inquiry, in addition to explicit instruction and knowledge building, it seems intuitively true to me, not evidence-based, and I would love to have a research study to do this. I don't have the budget for this, but that those inquiry skills over time, practiced, modeled, which one might say is a form of explicit instruction, but put that to the side, is that that what we would see then is a crystallization of those skills as you get older and as you get wiser, and that you add more knowledge and you add more wisdom and experience because you've practiced them over time. Or the converse is, if you haven't, and this is one of my arguments, is that in 1983, A Nation at Risk came out and really set us on this sort of accountability trajectory, which was more about answers and less about, sort of, I guess the way to frame it is it sort of disincentivized teachers who might be a little bit more Socratic in nature, or maybe a bit more inquiry styled. And so now we have decades of people who really are not well versed in that sort of inquiry mindset and that curiosity, and asking people when they say, tariffs are good. Well, what makes you say that? I'm curious. Or, you can imagine all the different examples that somebody might say, right? That trans women can play men's sports, or whatever the versions of it. Right? Oh, that's interesting. Tell me more. Why? I'm curious why you think that, as opposed to just really sort of hunkering down into your defensive posture. And so, long-winded way of asking what you think about the sort of use of inquiry over time as a way to sort of crystallize and grow those sort of background skills that somebody has, and I think arguably needs to be a successful, happy adult, or at least that those are important in being a successful, happy adult.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm being honest, and this is a little bit acknowledged, I guess, in the way you even framed the question, like, I haven't seen a lot of research to suggest
Right.
that critical thinking is like a muscle that you build, or that, that creativity is like now I'm going to get out my creativity toolkit, per se. What I feel is categorically true, and I can point to a lot of examples, but I'll take the example that you named. To me, the best fosterer of critical thinking in the example you named is a good knowledge base. So if we take those market crashes and we say, we have some people that were told that they'd be able to afford something, and in fact they weren't, what those people were missing is a form of financial literacy. I don't think that we could have prevented people. I don't know that, hey, if they had just practiced questioning every time they are told a fact by an authority, if they had just practiced how to scratch their head harder, that they would have turned up and not signed those mortgages that financially overexposed them. I think that if they had been given information about financial literacy and sort of what's basic finance and how do those interest rates work, and how, what kind of income do you have to have, and what does a family budget look like? I think that there's actually a knowledge base, a financial literacy knowledge base, that would best empower people to sit in front of a mortgage broker and say, I can't afford that if the following set of circumstances in my life change. So to me, the best fosterer of critical thinking and problem solving for that case is actually deeper study in financial literacy. And that is really a fit with why I am a kind of consistent advocate for this knowledge-rich type of schooling. And again, I'll shift over to that elementary context where, I'm one of the folks advocating, along with Natalie Wexler, to make sure that we are building kids' baseline knowledge in the sciences and in history when they are in elementary grades, and also in the arts. If you learn in the elementary grades what a democracy is, then that's a concept that it's not just about learning some facts about US history. It's about understanding what a democracy is, so that when you encounter the concept of a democracy, when you read about other democracies, when you read about communist countries as you get later into history, you have a framework for understanding what a democracy is and how other systems of governance are different from a democracy. So you're building a schema about governance while you're studying that history, right? So the concept behind this knowledge-rich schooling is, let's give kids that schema. In In the sciences, you should know what a habitat is and how different habitats tie to ecosystems. And this is really good baseline knowledge for when you go and do any kind of later study in the sciences and climate, et cetera. So that's the type of schooling that I've been wanting to advance. And we hear stories when we go to schools where they're studying these knowledge building curricula. You hear it's fascinating to talk to the librarians, because the librarians consistently say, as soon as this curriculum was brought in, we brought in a more knowledge rich curriculum. And let's say it's EL education and there's a big frog unit in EL education. You hear the librarians say, suddenly all the kids want to read about frogs. They come into the library, they want more books about frogs. They're fascinated by frogs. And if I had a dime for every time I heard that story equivalent, and you hear it from the librarian, when you get to interview parents at roundtables, parents will say, yeah, suddenly my kid comes home and they're studying X in their curriculum, and they have all these questions about, I know when they're studying pollinators because they come home and they want to talk about pollinating, and they want, when we're planting the garden, they want to ask, they're asking all these questions about what are the pollinators in our backyard. And so it's really clear to me, based on the stories that I hear, that actually kids' natural curiosity, and in fact, kids taking agency and in going to further their studies in a domain, was actually sparked by that pollinator unit or that frog unit in the first place. So I want kids that think critically. I'm raising an 8th grader who, boy, she started thinking critically about me. I want us to be building critical thinkers and problem solvers and nurturing all of those talents in our kids. But I do believe that a lot of that, it's that baseline knowledge, and it's that sparking the learning for kids that often becomes the springboard for that later work. And then as you get into later grades, again, you can take that kid who's already learned the baseline facts about democracy, and you can give that kid a more open-ended task that child could do, to be doing more self-directed study about picking what society they want to study, to be doing some learning around different models of different democracies around the country. But first, teach the kids the baseline info about democracy, because if they get there and you give them that open-ended challenge, or if you give them that open-ended challenge early before you've introduced the foundational concepts, you'll have kids floundering.
Yeah, so I agree, but I also think there's another piece that, and I see it sometimes in my conversations with some folks. I'm not saying you're doing this, but some folks who they really lean into Daniel Willingham's idea that, knowledge, critical thinking is domain specific, right? And I think that's true. I do think I've been really thinking a lot about this lately, is that it seems clear to me that there's maybe a difference of critical thinking that is domain specific, and then there's a more generalized kind of critical thinking. And so, the response generally is, if we talk about inquiry or critical thinking, the response from some folks on social media is generally something like, knowledge is the driver of critical thinking. I mean, it's just this sort of pat answer. And I think that's very true, but it's not the only driver of critical thinking. And when I think it's obviously true that the more knowledge you have about something, the more deep your critical thinking can be. I do think we can think critically about something of which we have very little knowledge, but it's just not going to be very deep critical thinking. So when I think about, for example, my mom was recovering from a couple of injuries over the last year, and as part of that, my brother and I were helping take care of her, and there was one incident where she had a doctor recommending a procedure that she really, really, really didn't want to do, mortifyingly so. And I don't have much knowledge about what the procedure was. It was a catheter. And I was able to ask enough questions and the right questions to kind of get to a point where we were able to hold off on that procedure for, I think, 12 hours and then recheck and at that point, then she didn't need to do it, and that saved her from a pretty traumatic sort of experience. And so I think that is an example of when we're adults, we're going to experience things that we don't have knowledge about, whether it's housing or healthcare or whatever. Do we have the ability to be skeptical, to answer, to ask questions, to really identify what are the questions I should be asking, and then based on that question, that response, and those responses, and kind of dig into it. And that's one of my concerns about the sort of just knowledge building approach. And again, I'm not saying that that's what you're advocating for is knowledge only, but that if there's such a focus on knowledge building and that all critical thinking happens in domain specific situations and there is no critical thinking outside of that, I've seen sort of claims like that, which I think are nonsensical, but that we're missing, that we're sort of coming up short in helping our students being prepared for the modern world, if that makes sense.
Well, again, this is where I just wish I had brought the right lesson or examples to be going to the tapes, because in the classrooms using these knowledge building curricula, I don't know, have you spent any time in any classrooms using wit and wisdom, core knowledge, EL education, bookworms?
No, I'm usually working with teachers.
Yeah. So, if you look at the lessons, and I like to name names because some of these are open source. You can go look at the EL education curriculum online. You can go look at you can get samples of bookworms. It's open source. You can look at the core knowledge original materials at the core knowledge website. Today it's distributed by Amplify, and they've also done some light modifications of the materials, enhance them over time in their distribution. But a lot of this stuff is open source, so you can just go look at it. And you absolutely have teachers engaging in noticing and wondering, and let's interrogate this topic that we're looking at as a part of those lessons. There is not one of those curricula that looks like, at a lesson level, let's lecture kids and quote unquote drill them with facts, which is what you hear people, they hear knowledge building and they think, this must be a teacher lecturing, and today is the day. If today is the frog lesson in EL education, there's a teacher sitting there with, diagrams and lecturing, and students are, no. In the frog unit of EL education, students read a mix of fiction and nonfiction that happen to have frogs as a topic. And yes, there is discussion of frog anatomy and frog habitats and all those things. There's intentional thought about how that unit and the text selections even in that unit contain the academic vocabulary so that students learn high leverage words like habitat and ecosystem and metamorphosis and, with butterflies or evolution. These are words that we need across domains. So how are those units crafted so that kids are building academic vocabulary? And when kids go to do their writing, kids are writing, then they shift and they do some writing, and they happen to be writing about frogs, which, by the way, fits with this cognitive science principle of, if I'm writing about the thing that's in my working memory, I am better able to focus on the writing craft and the sentence structure, because we just talked about frogs. So I'm writing a sentence about frogs. It's right there. It's top of mind, literally. So it's all thoughtfully designed, but none of it looks like kids being drilled with facts and being quizzed the next day on, did you remember parts of an amphibian? So if we go to the tapes, I actually think you'd find that there is lots of critical conversation and lots of pushing kids to not just pull facts out of the texts, but also to be thoughtful about their work they're doing. And I'll go back to EL education. Again, it's open source. You can look at it. At the end of each module, there is a module ending activity. And many times those activities are not just a written activity. Lots of times it is a project-oriented activity. I've been in EL education schools and seen the group projects that come out as the end of module activity for some of the modules. I've seen the dioramas that kids are asked to build about the frog habitat or what have you. So if you really look, this is what I mean when I say there's this intentional building of kids' knowledge, but at the end, they are asked to do something that actually has a strong project orientation to it. It might not be exactly what you mean by project-based learning, but it doesn't start with here's like learning blank slate and now I want you to figure out the thing you want to learn and go do the exploration. But there's nothing dry and rote about it. So at the rubber meets the road level, I think this is the kind of instruction that most people would say, yeah, that I can see elements of what I want in this. But it's a quote unquote scripted curriculum that does give that progression to teachers and tee up for teachers the text to use and the academic vocabulary that they're trying to intentionally help teachers call attention to as they do the lesson activities, et cetera, because there's a premium there on making sure not just that knowledge is centered in the lessons, but also one thing we don't talk enough about with knowledge building curriculum is you don't want kids building the same knowledge every year. Notoriously in districts that have do-it-yourself curricula and teachers being empowered to create a lot of the lessons without a common curriculum, you see that, oh, look, it's the fall, and so there's going to be a lesson on trees because it's the fall. And in multiple grades, we are talking about trees. And it's February, so how many kids in how many grade levels are studying Rosa Parks because it's February, right?
Right.
The repetitiveness in knowledge acquisition that you can get when there isn't a common plan about what the topic progression should be. Whereas with each of the knowledge building curricula, there is this intentional choice that third grade's the frog year in EL education, and so fourth grade's not the frog year. We cover frogs. We're onto pollinators. I think I'm getting the pollinator year wrong. But in any case, there's this intentional look at across K-5, how can I best introduce a core set of information in sciences, a core set of information in history. How do I give kids just enough schema in the sciences and history that then whatever they go and study in those later grades, they're going to be able to have those access points. That's what it looks like. But again, I really do hope if you and anyone take one thing away from this conversation, it's go to the tapes, go to those websites, actually look at the lessons and look at how de minimis the teacher lecture component of the lessons in many of these curricula happens to be. It's a lot of text-centered work and connected writing to the texts. It looks like, frankly, a lot of the way people talk about even balanced literacy curricula looking.
Yeah, and the curriculum piece reminds me the importance of coherence, I think, is the term that they use in the I guess PDF book that Paul Kirshner and I think Dylan Williams on that multi-author, and actually we did a salon conversation and talking about that book, that resource, because I think it's a really good resource. As you were talking, it reminded me of a quote I heard recently. It's something like, the refutation of a caricature is nothing more than a caricature of a refutation. And I think that, and this is something that the paper that I mentioned earlier that I'm collaborating on with Cindy Niebel, we're trying to call out those caricatures, right? Those trauma. So the thing that that I think is very true, and it's sort of funny to me, is that the folks on one end say the other side is hegemonic and vice versa, and we should not caricature, sort of science of learning as being dry and lecture and those kinds of things. It can happen, but that's not generally what the sort of prescription is. I do think about choral responses being not particularly exciting and dry, but that's a whole other podcast. And on the other side, the conflation of inquiry and discovery learning is one that just activates me, because it's like it's not the same thing, and so we should be thoughtful about the descriptions of those kinds of things. So I'm mindful of time here. Anything you want to say in the limited amount of time we have here about you've mentioned the lack of full books and sort of long reading in curriculum, but the new NAEP scores that came out. Yeah. Why do you think this is? Is it devices? Is it? And I know you don't have much time, but I say a French goodbye.
Here's what I will say about that. Here are the two most important things. And I'll send you the piece that is actually published on the Curriculum Insight Project blog. That has been an effort where I'm working with educators from across the country to be better illuminating some of the nuances of curricula, because again, I think we talk past each other too often, or even make assumptions about what curricula look like. So being able to say really precise things like, yeah, there are no books in Wonders grades 4 to 6 is much more precise than basals are bloated and the content isn't good enough, right? So I'll send you that piece, and I hope folks check out the Curriculum Insight Project. As for the NAEP scores, it's grim, and you won't find me to have any single culprit or single solution in this conversation. We were talking about high schoolers yesterday and 8th graders in science, and look, I don't think we can take off the table that the device distraction factor, the impact of school closures during the pandemic, obviously absenteeism, time in seat is critical to learning, volume of time of study, like school time matters. And so of course the absenteeism factor has got to be a real headwind to academic progress. But rather than armchair philosophize about how those factors commingle and which one's more important than another, if there's one thing I want people to know about the NAEP, it's that there are 4 states in early grades that have had success raising reading outcomes since 2020. Those 4 states include, most notoriously, Mississippi, and people talk about that as a real outlier, and it is. It's been at this work the longest, so it has the best outcomes, as the benefit of time, as well as a really effective approach. But also Louisiana, Tennessee, and Alabama. That's your 4 states where we can see signs of gain since the pandemic. Every other state, as of the last NAEP release for elementary and for middle schools, every other state was flat or down since the pandemic, and that's obviously that's a big downer. But let's look to the 4 states that have made gains, and they've made gains because they're doing the things that so many advocates like myself would encourage. There's a strong focus on foundational skills. They all have had their form of science of reading reforms, but really intelligently done, strong coaching models. They all have, the 3 with the strongest outcomes have all brought in knowledge building curricula. Louisiana and Tennessee led with knowledge building curricula as the beginning of their reform, and then layered on science of reading types of teacher training and reforms. Mississippi started with the teacher training and 3rd grade retention and the early grades efforts, and then in 2019 started to introduce knowledge building curricula. Mississippi honestly has a ways to go, because actually Ed Reports got a lot of things wrong in their most recent era of reviews. So Ed Reports has called Wonders and Into Reading adequately knowledge building, and many of us who've looked closely at them say, nuh-uh, not even a little. So I think Mississippi could be putting the pedal to the metal and making its gains even stronger if it got higher quality curricula consistently statewide. But Alabama is a state that hasn't yet focused on the knowledge building and broader curriculum. They've only focused on the foundational skills curricula. But Alabama plans to start focusing on the full curricula and later grades with the knowledge building piece. So if you look at those 4 states, they all have earned their gains, and state scale gains are not easy to achieve. I'm sure I don't have to tell you. In many of these states, everyone but Alabama has like multiple years of successive gains. They've achieved that through adopting the kinds of science of reading and knowledge building approaches that advocates would seek. Now, we've just finished a podcast to say that's not just some dry rote, these are really rich approaches to teaching in each of these states. But I want people to focus on the leaders, because there's no reason that every one of the other 46 states couldn't take approaches from those 4 states. So to me, I think a lot of the work of the next decade is going to be what leverage points, what influence points can we use to get more states taking that on. And that will require going to the tapes, looking at these programs, and getting past our tribes to get it right.
Well, I know you have to go, so I want to wrap us up here. I think your point is well taken on folks on the sort of more inquiry side, not caricaturing and sort of thinking that those things are dry. I would make the opposite point. I think the sort of science of learning folks, especially the loudest advocates, I would love for them to be more willing to talk about the importance of inquiry. And sometimes it makes me laugh. It's almost like they can't say the word because it's like that's the enemy's weapon and I can't touch it. But my assumption is that they actually do use it, as you mentioned, that it's a part of those lessons and that curriculum that is knowledge rich and should be. So to not talk about it seems to be doing a disservice. But your blog is curriculuminsightproject.substack.com. We'll put that in the show notes. She is on Twitter more than she should be, I think.
True story.
and I'm guilty of it as well. At Karen Vaites, Vaites, and we'll put that in the show notes. Any other things you want to say or mention before we sign off?
I'll send you that piece on the Southern Surge. That's actually on my own Substack. So like many, I've migrated over to Substack. If you haven't gone to Substack, it's a much happier place than Twitter nowadays. So for all of our sanity, let's all go to Substack.
Yeah, then it'll be a terrible place because we're all there yelling at each other. Well, thanks so much for the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.